Financial markets around the world have taken a beating.
Markets are falling sharply in Asia.
Nearly $150 billion was wiped off the ASX in less than an hour.
Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index is down around 10% per week.
As investors fear Donald Trump's trade tariffs could trigger a global recession.
I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something.
China's already hit back with reciprocal tariffs, but we're still waiting to see how Europe will respond.
Good morning.
Yes, the EU's response so far has been pretty silent, while markets around the world are tanking for a third day in a row. Since Liberation Day, the US S&P 500 is down almost 14%, the European Stock 600 is down almost 13%, and Asia also not having a great time, with the SSE almost down 8%. And the reason? You guessed it, Trump's insanely aggressive new tariff plan. In case you haven't realized, he slapped a 10% tariff on all goods coming into the US, plus extra penalties for countries he claims are unfair trade partners. He's calling them reciprocal tariffs, targeting nations where the US runs a big trade deficit. Now, we're not going to get into how these numbers were calculated, but safe to say, they're nowhere near accurate. For example, the US claims Vietnam charges a 90% tariff on American goods. Vietnam's actual number? More like 9.4%. Anyway, the countries that were hit the hardest are Vietnam, China, and poor Cambodia. So how have countries responded? Well, it's a mixed bag really. China came out swinging, fast and hard. Within days, they slapped 34% reciprocal tariffs on US goods. And let's not forget, China and the US are massive trade partners. We're talking about a $583 billion relationship. America exports $143 billion worth of goods to China and imports a whopping $438 billion back. So yes, this is a trade war between giants. Vietnam, on the other hand, they folded pretty quickly. Instead of retaliating, they announced they'd remove all trade barriers with the US. Their argument is that America is punishing their own consumers, because Vietnam isn't just any exporter. It's a cornerstone in the global manufacturing machine. They're a production hub for brands like Adidas, Lululemon, and Nike. In fact, Nike makes over half of its footwear in Vietnam. So yeah, not exactly a country you want to pick a fight with if you like your sneakers. But today, we're zooming in on Trump's favorite punching bag, the European Union.
I think they've been freeloading. The European Union's been absolutely terrible to us on trade. Terrible.
The EU tariffs come in three lovely bundles. 25% on aluminum and steel, 25% on car imports, and a 20% on basically everything else. And that's no small deal. The EU does a lot of business with the US. In 2024 alone, the EU exported 530 billion euros worth of goods to America, while importing 333 billion euros in return. That's a 198 billion euro trade surplus. And when it comes to exports, Germany's got the most to lose. Why? Because vehicles are the EU's second largest export category to the US, making up nearly 10% of all exports. So yeah, that 25% car tariff, that's not just a jab, it's a punch straight into Germany's industrial heart. So, how has the EU responded to Trump's tariffs so far? To start with, the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen already offered the US to talk about a free trade deal. But the big question remains, will Trump engage? If not, then so far, the EU has only responded to bundle number 1, the initial wave of tariffs. Brussels is already in the process of reinstating up to 26 billion euros worth of tariffs on iconic American brands. Think bourbon whiskey, blue jeans, and Harley-Davidson motorbikes, the usual suspects. But what about Bundle 2 and Bundle 3? At this stage, the EU is still in internal negotiations, and here's where things get tricky. There's no unified position just yet. But in the end, most of the power over trade policy lies with the European Commission. Member states don't have a veto here. So what now? What can the EU actually do from now on? We see three options. And the first is to do nothing. In this scenario, the EU refrains from retaliation and instead pursues negotiations for tariff reductions and exemptions. It might also try to soften the economic blow by adjusting things like interest rates or the money supply, tools known as monetary policy, to keep the economy stable. This path would be the least costly in the short term, if the situation ended there. But the problem is, it likely won't. The Trump administration would likely be emboldened to push for further concessions. The second option is to respond with limited, targeted tariffs. This approach would mirror the EU's earlier response to the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum, selectively targeting Republican states and companies linked to the Trump administration. For example, the EU could target soybeans from Louisiana, the home state of the US House Speaker, Mike Johnson. But limited retaliation comes with risks. It could be read as a sign that the EU is unwilling to escalate, handing the leverage back to Trump. That's exactly what happened when the EU slapped tariffs on bourbon whiskey, as Trump hit back with the threat of a 200% duty on European spirits. Eventually, the EU will be cornered. Either retreat and fall back to option 1, or escalate into a full-blown trade war, option 3. A full-blown trade war would mean broad, proportionate retaliation across most US imports. The EU could respond with a flat 20% tariff, just like the US did. The short-term economic hit would be real, but the message would be crystal clear. Europe is serious. And that kind of pressure might be exactly what it takes to bring the US back to the negotiating table. And here's the thing, the EU holds real leverage when it comes to trade. It could strike the US where it's especially vulnerable: services. While the EU runs a €157 billion trade surplus in goods, it has a €109 billion deficit in services, particularly digital services, where US companies dominate. The European Commission has been careful not to name names, but France did not hesitate. Right out of the gate, it said that American tech giants like Apple, Google, and Meta should be targeted. And that brings us to the EU's most powerful legal weapon, the Anti-Coercion instrument. With it, the EU could do more than impose tariffs. It could delay or deny business licenses from US firms, block access to public contracts, restrict intellectual property rights, or even ban US investments in the EU altogether. This wouldn't just be retaliation. It would be a coordinated strategic defense of European sovereignty. Here's how I see it. The most likely outcome will be somewhere between option 2 and 3. I can imagine the EU imposing tariffs on cars, perhaps alongside regulatory pressure on US digital services, using tools like the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, and the Digital Services Act, the DSA. These aren't tariffs, but they're powerful. The DMA is designed to rein in big tech gatekeeper companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, and Meta by forcing them to open up their platforms to competitors and stop self-preferencing. The DSA, meanwhile, makes platforms more accountable for the content they host and the way they use data. Together, they give the EU the ability to tighten the rules specifically on US tech giants, creating real business headaches without formally declaring a trade war. Then, I'd also expect the EU to present a clear roadmap, outlining how its response could escalate if the situation doesn't improve. At the same time, I don't think France's push for immediate use of the anti-coercion instrument is the right move just yet. For now, negotiation should remain the priority, but if talks fail, all measures must stay on the table. To me, this is turning into a waiting game, a test of political stamina. Will EU leaders stay united long enough to apply real pressure, or will some of them break ranks and cut side deals with Trump? And on the other side, how long until Trump is forced into a U-turn by a weakening US economy and sinking approval ratings? And we're already seeing signs with massive demonstrations across the US over the weekend. If the economic pressure keeps building, Trump might not have a choice but to come back to the negotiation table. All I can really hope for is that the EU does respond, and does it with strength and unity. No solo efforts or mixed messaging, but a coordinated front that shows we're serious. And of course, let's diversify. We need to strengthen trade with Mercosur, India, and Canada, so that a situation like this simply doesn't happen again. But what do you think the EU should do out of these three options? And do you agree with my opinion? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to learn more about how the European Union could evolve, check out how a 4-tiered EU would work, with new members like Canada and even Northern African states. And to support us further, consider joining us on Patreon and vote on a video idea every week. And thank you to our presidents, Jan Schauke, Christian Peter, AGVD, BJ Unite Europe, Stefan, and Mr. Probot.